Hello everyone, welcome back to History 108. In this lecture we will be looking at the Cold War and presenting an argument that is much more current than the way the Cold War is typically taught. When I was in graduate school, there was a book called We Now Know, which basically blamed Russia for all this drama that happened. And definitely there's some elements to that, but the reality is that the story is much more complex. The United States also play an important role in all this. So I titled this lecture The Cold War Rethinking the US versus Them, Good Guy versus Bad Guy Narrative. First, let's look at the objectives. Number one, the goal is to explain what caused the Cold War. And again, most of this is done on more current scholarship to show you how really both sides play an important role along with other global issues that were happening at that time. Number two, examine the implementation of the policy called containment, which would impact the way the United States looked at different, particularly what we call third world countries for the next 40 years. Really, the idea, as the word implies, is to limit the spread of communism. And number three, we're going to address how the Cold War, how Cold War politics impacted American citizens. So, yes, there's a lot of political issues in the global stage, but the Cold War also impacted us here in the U.S. And you have, plays, or I guess it's a movie now, called The Crucible, and a few other that kind of address the politics in the United States, where there's this fear for speaking out against certain things that are completely wrong, but because people are so afraid of quote unquote communists, at every corner, they stay silent or they're complicit in some of the illegal activity that the U.S. government is doing at this time in the 1950s. So we'll explore that. Really, the interesting part is how is it that we give up those freedoms, right, in a time of uncertainty. So let's look at how all this got started. So before I start this lecture, I quickly want to let you know that I do write down my lectures, so you'll hear me kind of reading them. I have to type them out because I use very specific statistics or facts and also direct quotes, so it makes it easier for me to remember those specific quotes based on all the research that I've done. So at the end, you'll see all the different sources I use. So if it sounds like I'm reading, I am reading because I write a script for these, all right? It also makes it go quicker so I don't have too many pauses while I think of what to say next. So the war was now over, and there are only two major powers left in the world that still even resonate today. The US and the USSR were the two major powers standing, and though they were allies during World War II, times had changed and they had become adversaries. Because the USSR was a communist country, the relationship between the two countries was always touchy, dating back to the Bolshevik Revolution. This is like 1916, 17 period, where the US would not even recognize their existence until the mid-1930s. Communism and Marxism was never that large in the US. However, there are many examples of activists who engage in communist, Marxist, anarchist, and socialist circles in the late 19th and early 20th century. We did have a communist party, which was called the CPUSA, but for the most part, communism was typically seen as a threat, particularly after the Russian Revolution. The Red Scare of the 1920s seemed to set the tone for a very anti-communist sentiment in the United States. However, the number of communists within the US was never really that high or even a threat to the American way of life. It is estimated that about 25,000, maybe 40,000 at most, people could have been labeled communists. Not that they were hardcore communists. But most of them were just sympathetic to workers' causes as strikes erupted throughout the U.S. after World War I due to an increase in inflation, which doubled while workers' wages remained stagnant. Of course, employers blamed the quote-unquote Bolsheviks and the quote-unquote bomb-throwing radicals during this time. The Justice Department, led by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, seemed to be hyper-focused to attack this quote-unquote red menace, and had J. Edgar Hoover conduct raids and round up anyone that seemed like a threat, including people like Emma Goldman, who championed workers' rights her entire life. She was actually an anarchist. What the Red Scare accomplished was actually very little, but it did set the tone for future relations with the USSR, as any communist, socialist, any progressive, or liberal was labeled a potential threat to national security. This is something that we still see today. So, anytime somebody advocates for any kind of social justice, they are typically given the label, quote unquote, communist. So this set the tone for the relationship between the US and Russia, and as you can see, it was always very antagonistic. During the war, the relationship between the US and Russia was a tense one, as both helped fight a common enemy, but were always wary of each other. For example, quote, in 1943, the American government created an ill feeling by excluding the Soviets from the surrender of Italy. The delay of the Allied invasion of France until 1944 embittered the Soviets, who were desperately resisting the Germans at the cost of millions of lives. The American government further strained relations by sharing news of its secret atomic bomb project with the British, but not with the Soviets. Again, these people were allies. Unquote. At the Yalta Conference, the Big Three agreed that, quote, national self-determination, where countries would decide their own future, would be followed, while at the same time, powerful nations should dominate other nations within, quote unquote, a sphere of influence. This became apparent with Poland, where Stalin quickly installed a loyal Polish government, which caused fear amongst the British and the Americans. So after World War II, many countries were left in ruin, which benefited the US, since the majority of the war was fought outside its territory. Basically, the people who were producing goods, i.e. the Europeans, could no longer do this because of the war, right? So with the war over, Europe and other parts of the world were rebuilding, which allowed former colonies to break away and gain their independence. So many of these European countries own colonies in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America. So these countries began to break free. The US saw this as an opportunity to gain what has been labeled soft power by providing billions of dollars to, quote, UN agencies for food, clothing, and medicine for the needy people in Germany, Japan, China, and Eastern Europe. The British borrowed close to $4 billion from the US in 1946 to pay for food imports, unquote. In fact, the aftermath was a boom for the US as it was able to pick up the pieces of the desolation throughout the world. So this was an economic benefit for the US, right? They continued their strategy by, quote, erecting a circle of air and naval bases around Europe and Asia, causing Soviet distrust, unquote. Though the US has often been presented as the protector and defender of freedom, it is important to note that the Cold War was caused by both parties not able to communicate clearly and causing mistrust and suspicion while they carved out their own interests. When Vice President Harry Truman succeeded Roosevelt in April of 1945, he sought to, quote, stand up to the Russians, unquote. The American Consul at Moscow, George Kennan, sent a telegram to the State Department explaining, quote, there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence between capitalism and socialism, unquote, because Stalin believed that capitalist nations would eventually attack socialist nations. This was proven true when in Greece, the monarchist government backed by the British were fighting the communist guerrillas, going against the very principle that was addressed at the Yalta Conference about self-determination. So in other words, the United States was butting in when each country was supposed to set up their own form of government. With the British no longer being able to support the Greeks, the Americans took the torch, and on March 12, 1947, the Truman Doctrine exemplified how the next 40 years would play out, as he stated, quote, the U.S. must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, unquote, thus presenting the US as protectors and neglecting to recognize how the West was doing the exact same thing as the Soviets. What this new doctrine accomplished was, quote, a policy of diplomatic, economic, and military strategies for containing Soviet expansion, unquote. Containment was a vague concept, but with the Chinese Communist victory in 1949, the US saw the writing on the wall that capitalism was in trouble, particularly with decolonization, who were once ruled by these by these European capitalist nations that are now left in complete shambles, giving what was then called the Third World an opportunity to develop ties with the Soviets. So now that these colonies, these former colonies of European countries, gained their freedom, they had the option to either continue doing what they were doing, being controlled by Europeans, or looking at an alternative, which tended to be the Soviets. So let me give you an example of the way the United States used this idea of soft power in global politics. So the best example that we have is Saudi Arabia. So in 1942, a new city emerged in, quote, the Arabian desert with 5,000 Americans working and living in air-conditioned offices, clubhouses, and movie theaters, and homes that looked like as if they had been lifted from Florida by a magic carpet, unquote. The American colony had the country's only swimming pool and hospitals, where no Arabs were allowed to enter. In Arabia, it was oil where U.S. companies struck the deal with Ibn Saud, patriarch of a nomadic clan, securing the rights until 2005 to any petroleum found in the area, twice the size of Texas. So basically, the United States said, "We'll, drill out this oil, and we'll help you, beat up your enemies in your region." Well, they found a huge reservoir in Dhahran in 1938, and this clan, the Saudi clan, now had the economic power to push their agenda of Wahhabism, which was, quote, puritanical faith that rejected liberalism, pluralistic Islamic practices in favor of Quranic literalism and a strict punitive code of Sharia justice, rejecting unions for workers, prohibited music and education for women, and forced nomadic Arabs into settlement, unquote. So the United States, to some extent, made a deal with this country to protect them. Obviously, we're a very democratic nation, but in return, we would not meddle into their business and let them rule the way they ruled, which was very almost like a dictatorship, right? The Arabs the Arab workers dug ditches and hauled loads in 120 degree temperature for 90 cents a day, all for American interests. Literate Arabs resented the American presence, and when 13,000 Arabs erupted in protest and went on strike, the American companies, in collaboration with, quote, Saudi's U.S. trained police, broke the strike, unquote. This compound was like any other compound that housed Americans around the world, protecting American interests, and created apartheid-like systems, which went against U.S. values. However, the U.S. believed that these were necessary relationships in order to keep the Soviets at bay. Yet many were concerned that they had lied in bed with dictators and kings that oppressed their population. In this example, one can see how decolonization could ultimately hurt the U.S. because it pushed many nations to the Soviet side by acting in this behavior, right? However, the U.S. needed these colonies in order to maintain a standard of living in the U.S. At this time, we needed oil. This is the age of the car in places like the West, Arizona, California. So oil was very important. Things like this. So I'll give you the example of Saudi Arabia, but this was happening all over the United States. Guatemala is another good example of something like this happening around the same time period. So one way to maintain influence throughout the world was for the U.S. to give money to these nations that were rebuilding after the war. The Marshall Plan was the tool to gain control of these nations, as from 1948 to 1952, quote, $13 billion went to boost agricultural and industrial output, increase exports, and promote economic cooperation, unquote. This boost helped rebuild European cities, stabilize governments, weaken communist parties in those nations, and made them dependent on the US. It offered Europe technical and management advice that helped spread American farming techniques, labor policies, and manufacturing practices. So basically, we are the leaders of this world, and we're kind of helping Europe, Western Europe specifically here, to rebuild. All European countries, including the USSR, were invited to participate in the Marshall Plan, and the USSR even contemplated participating for a while. However, the Russians saw this as a ploy to dominate by the US to dominate Europe and force Eastern Europeans into their control, as was clear when Stalin ordered a Czech coup. Ultimately, the Marshall Plan was successful as communist parties in Western Europe diminished and American exports increased, allowing Americans to profit from the rebuilding stage after the war. So a lot of times, we gave them the money, they would spend that money and buy things from the United States, and then we ship them the goods. So that money kind of came always kind of full circle in the way that kind of Marshall Plan worked. However, this increased the animosity between the two global superpowers, between the US and the USSR. The friction between these former allies continued, though, and distrust only built with each passing year. Military assistance became the next major cornerstone of containment as the US committed to defend Europe because this was the only way they felt that they could stop the spread of communism. The Czech coup foreshadowed what would come next, particularly in a place like Germany, which was still rebuilding and lacked any military protection, particularly against the Russians who were quickly trying to influence Eastern Europe. The division of Berlin showcased this struggle, as Berlin was divided into 4 zones, with the US, Britain, and France, who were all allies, controlled 3/4 of the city and provided funds to rebuild, while the Russians accused the West of going against the Yalta Conference, which stated that all 4 nations had to, quote, agree before any restructuring of Germany could occur, unquote. All this toggling only increased the possibility of war, as one can see with the Berlin airlift in 1948 to 49, where Stalin closed off the city since it resided in the east under Stalin's influential zone. So quickly, I want to show you these pictures. Here's the Red Scare of the 1920s with Zacco and Vanzetti. Over here you have the Yalta Conference, and down here you have the, that basically the oil field that was created in Saudi Arabia by what is today Chevron, and caused all that friction down there. But basically, like I said, we've helped build Saudi Arabia, which impacts us today. So now let's look at creating a global power, how the United States became a global power. So in April of 1949, the US helped Western Europe with the construction of the North American Treaty Organization, which is today called NATO, which created a military alliance that obligated the US, quote, to come immediately to Western Europe's defense in an event of a Soviet attack. Besides putting American bases and soldiers permanently in Europe, NATO extended the protection of Americans' atomic shield to its NATO partners, unquote. Again, the Russians were not excited about this, so they naturally reacted and built their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, among Eastern Europeans, creating, quote, unquote, the Iron Curtain that Churchill addressed years before. The next major cause of the Cold War were the global revolutions that I mentioned earlier. These are the places that we used to call the Third World. China being the most prominent one. You also have Korea, another significant one. But in China, the war between communists and the nationalist governments set the tone for our modern conflicts. The US sent the nationalist Jiang Zemin regime $2 billion in aid rather than sending troops. But by 1949, the communists had won the Civil War. Throughout Asia, this theme continued, with many countries having communist governments and other nations in Latin America and in Africa becoming vulnerable to these ideas, forcing the US to rethink its strategy of containment. It is noted that, quote, territories formerly of little strategic interest, such as Southeast Asia and Africa, became vital to security. Though Truman favored self determination, he tolerated Latin American dictatorships, European colonial dominion, and South Africa's white supremacist rule because these undemocratic regimes opposed communism. So basically, what this historian is saying that the United States, we practice democracy, but it was okay for those countries to practice these kind of dictatorships because it benefited us. So as you can see, global annihilation was imminent according to the US, so it needed a more aggressive foreign policy to keep the Russians at bay. Thus, the National Security Council document number 68 was produced calling for, quote, a massive buildup of US military forces to resist the Soviet menace anywhere in the world that it might arise. It recommended defense budgets of $15 billion a year, quote, 4 times the size that was appropriated in 1950, unquote. In addition, it, quote, imposed order in post-colonial areas and sought more powerful weapons, seeking the building of the so-called hydrogen bomb or super bomb, unquote. This top secret document helped spur an economic boom in the American South and the American Southwest. Much of it was funded through deficit spending and federal borrowing, generating jobs and growth. The Manhattan District Project was so secretive that not even Vice President Truman knew about it, and when it came into realization, Secretary of War Henry Stimson said the U.S. would soon have, quote, the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city, unquote. On April 6, 1945, he was correct. The Enola Gay carried a 5-ton atomic bomb that dropped on Hiroshima, quote, destroying 2/3 of the city and killing 80,000 people instantly, many of them vaporizing by the intense heat. By the end of the year, 60,000 more people had died from burns, wounds, and radiation poisoning, unquote. Though this helped shift the war effort, the U.S. lack of communication with the Soviets, particularly about the atomic bomb, and not sharing the scientific knowledge with an ally, contributed to this wedge, causing the Cold War and causing the Soviets to ramp up their own atomic research. In 1949, the Soviets detonated its first nuclear device in Kazakhstan. By 1955, both the Soviets and the US had the ability to destroy each other. This was the atomic age, and every part of American culture was now shaped by the Cold War, from politics, science, the economy, and even popular culture, such as films and music. Ultimately, the Cold War allowed, quote, Americans to accept things that they had always feared, particularly within a democracy. Things like secrecy, debt, alliances, a massive standing army, and a centralized direction of the economy, each magnifying the role of the federal government. So these are things that we used to fear, and now we were all okay with it. So here in this picture, you see the Chinese kind of winning the revolution, and then this is the atomic bomb. I think in Hiroshima, it just shows you how it just completely destroys the city. So let's look at the impact that the Cold War had within the United States, and I labeled this slide American Insecurity. So far we have seen how the Cold War redefined geopolitics. However, the Cold War at home had a much more devastating impact. The nuclear threat was real, now with both nations having the bomb, and that was reflected in the anxieties of Americans and as they were drinking atomic cocktails and dancing the atomic polka, quote unquote. By 1947, flying saucer sightings exploded to 35 in the US and Canada, pulling on anxieties and uneasiness of the era. So this is an age where, again, a flying saucer, yeah, it might be an alien, but more than likely it was the Russians spying on us. At least that's what people thought. Movies also reflected this new reality where radioactive pollution could transform the very world people lived in. For example, in the movie Godzilla, quote, a nuclear explosion awakens a fire-breathing monster who terrorizes Tokyo. He was an unstoppable nuclear force that obliterated everything in his path, unquote. Even children were impacted by the cultural shifts as their comic books touched on the subject where the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man were spawned by contact with radioactive material. In The Incredible Hulk, quote, a scientist exposed to gamma rays is transformed into a green 300-pound giant, while a bite from a radioactive spider turned nerdish lab assistant Peter Parker into Spider-Man, unquote. The nuclear threat meant that citizens needed to be vigilant, so government propaganda played an important role in trying to calm its citizenry, reassuring them that they could survive an atomic blast. The duck and cover, quote unquote, exercises that school children learn at school taught them to hide under their desks with their hands clasped firmly over their heads. You can see that right here. Here's the atomic cocktail, by the way. In fact, Bert the turtle taught children to cover because flying debris could cause physical harm, ignoring the fact that more than likely the blast would have vaporized them. Right? So, I don't think this covering your head is going to save your life there. This continued with the federal government urging Americans to build bomb shelters, which would cost about 20% of their salary. By 1956, the U.S. government began constructing secret, quote, centers throughout the nation to house government officials, unquote, in order for Congress to continue in case of an attack. Underground mini pentagons were built near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to house the president and his cabinet and remained in operation until 1995. The reality of the Cold War was much worse on American society, as people allowed the government to take away civil liberties in a time of uncertainty. In the eyes of both the government and the U.S. citizenry, they saw communism everywhere. Ethnic whites who were once proud of their ethnic backgrounds, such as Italians and Greeks and Eastern Europeans, were now, quote, reluctant to emphasize their origins, unquote, for fear of what neighbors would think, particularly now that they lived in a very homogeneous suburban community. Americans feared the very government that was supposed to protect their liberties, and due to economic growth, helped create a homogeneous society that sacrificed their individuality for conformity. So we'll explore this more when we talk about suburbia. The Cold War set off a Red Scare that the results causing such damage within the U.S. that people's lives were completely ruined only because they believed in things such as the Bill of Rights, civil rights, gender equality, and a list of individual liberties that now seem we had taken for granted. As noted earlier, the Red Scare of the 1920s was instrumental to what took place in the 1950s. Quote, in 1948, Southerner opponents of the New Deal agricultural policies established the, quote, House of Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, who charged the New Deal farm officials were taking orders from Russia. In 1940, Congress enacted the Smith Act, which made it a federal crime for anyone to advocate the overthrow of the government. The CPUSA became an easy target, even though they were an official party at the time, yet never had a large base, only obtaining about 0.3% of the popular vote. However, the Truman administration charged 12 party leaders with the Smith Act, with 11 being convicted and sent to jail. In 1947, Truman established the Loyalty Program for federal employees, which resulted in close to 3,000 resignations and 379 dismissals, even though no spies were actually found in government. So you had to do a loyalty oath to your country in order to keep your job. In fact, and also say that you're never part of the Communist Party. In fact, those questioned had no legal recourse, and due process was non-existent, as they could not challenge the evidence or confront their accusers, and were guilty until proven innocent. It was during this time that politicians who sought to make a name for themselves exaggerated the communist threat for political gain. First-year Congressman Richard Nixon led a crusade against Hollywood, which he claimed was brainwashing young minds with communist ideas through film. All this made great political theater, but it was a complete waste of time, though it did destroy a lot of people's lives. Anyone that was considered progressive based on 1950s standards was considered a threat and the government was going to make an example out of them. Teachers and professors were attacked, books were banned, and even the Boy Scouts and the Campfire Girls, quote, came under suspicion for their advocacy of world peace and understanding. That's how crazy the world was back then. So it's interesting, some things might not change, right? So as you can see, geopolitics were complex, particularly because there was no real bad guy versus good guy. However, we did everything we could to create that illusion. Many of us growing up during the Cold War, myself included, have been taught in K through 12 to hate Russia and that they were the cause of all the fear and chaos around the world. However, what we found is that the truth was much more complex than a simple binary and that there was enough blame to go around. So let's finish this presentation. So what did we learn? Number one, we find that the Cold War would define global politics for the next 4 decades. We'll be talking about the Cold War here and there. All the way into the early 90s is where you see the this conflict to some extent come to a conclusion, and some people have said it came back. Right, it might be in different avenues. It could be with Russia, but we also see China became a major force, and a lot of it had to do with what's happening back then. Number two, Americans became more conservative due to the hysteria of the new Red Scare. It was a scary time, right? You didn't want to stand out. If you believed in things like, let's end Jim Crow, or, women should have equal say, or homosexuality is fine, or read certain books, you could be seen as a threat and be arrested, or you could lose your job, you could be blacklisted, right? All these things could happen to you just for believing in things that today we see as very normal, right? So it was a very scary time. And as I mentioned, quite significantly, immigrants who were proud to be Italian American or Greek American or Romanian American, right? Those immigrants that came at the turn of the century now were forced to assimilate into mainstream society by moving to the suburbs and losing that cultural heritage that they had. And lastly, civil rights basically went out the window during the time of economic prosperity and political instability. So it's kind of weird, right, that a lot of American citizens, I don't want to say all of them, because a lot of people were fighting this fight, and hopefully we'll have an activity that explores that. But those people that were fighting that fight, like I said, were blacklisted or were deported at times. Emma Goldman, as I mentioned earlier, they face some form of repression due to their beliefs. So it's weird that Americans say, "Yeah, take away my freedoms. It's okay," because I'm afraid of those communists. So I just want to leave you with these with the works cited page. Here's all the sources that I used to address this topic. All right. Hope you feel like you learned something.